The establishment of Israel in 1948 is deeply connected to the roots of the ongoing war in Gaza because it marked the beginning of a political, territorial, and humanitarian conflict that has never been fully resolved. To understand how events in 1948 contributed to today's violence, it is necessary to trace how the creation of a new state reshaped Palestine displaced its people, created unresolved refugee crises, hardened identities, militarized borders, and set in motion cycles of resistance and retaliation that continue to define Gaza's reality. Before 1948, Palestine was under British rule following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. During this period, tensions between Jewish immigrants and the Arab Palestinian population steadily increased. Jewish migration accelerated due to European anti-Semitism and later the horrors of the Holocaust, while Palestinian Arabs feared losing their land and political future. Britain's conflicting promises to both Jewish and Arab communities created a volatile situation. By the time the British decided to withdraw, violence between communities had already become widespread, laying the groundwork for a deeply divided land. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan that divided Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. Jewish leaders accepted the plan despite concerns, seeing it as a path to statehood. Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab states rejected it, viewing it as unjust, because it allocated a majority of the land to a Jewish population that was still a demographic minority. This rejection, combined with escalating violence, led directly to war following Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948. The war that followed resulted in Israel establishing control over more territory than originally proposed by the UN plan. For Palestinians, this period is known as the or catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes. Hundreds of villages were destroyed, and a massive refugee population was created. Many of these refugees ended up in Gaza, which transformed from a small coastal area into one of the most densely populated regions in the world. The trauma of displacement and loss became central to Palestinian identity, especially in Gaza, where families passed down memories of villages they could not return to. Gaza's connection to the events of 1948 is particularly direct because it became a repository for refugees who were never allowed to return to their homes inside what became Israel, unlike many refugee crises that eventually lead to resettlement or citizenship elsewhere. Palestinian refugees were largely kept in a state of limbo. This unresolved refugee issue hardened resentment and made Gaza a focal point of Palestinian suffering. The refusal to allow refugees to return became a foundational grievance that continues to fuel anger and resistance. After 1948, Gaza was administered by Egypt, not integrated as a sovereign Palestinian state. This meant Palestinians in Gaza lacked true political autonomy and statehood. Their lives were shaped by military administration, poverty, and overcrowding. This lack of a political solution reinforced the sense that the injustice of 1948 was ongoing, not a closed chapter. The absence of a Palestinian state, rooted in the outcomes of Israel's creation, left Gaza as a symbol of unfinished history. The 1967 war further entrenched the consequences of 1948. Israel captured Gaza from Egypt and began a military occupation that lasted decades. For Palestinians, this occupation was seen as a continuation of the original dispossession that began with Israel's establishment. Gaza became tightly controlled, economically dependent, and politically isolated. Israeli settlements in Gaza, later removed in 2005, were viewed by Palestinians as further proof that the displacement that started in 1948 was still unfolding. The rise of Palestinian resistance movements is also closely tied to 1948 groups such as the Palestine Liberation Organization and later Hamas emerged from the belief that Palestinians had been denied their homeland by force, and that armed resistance was the only way to reclaim rights lost during Israel's creation. Hamas, which now governs Gaza, explicitly frames its struggle as a response to the injustice of 1948, not merely to later occupations. Its ideology draws heavily on the narrative of dispossession and resistance born from Israel's founding. Israel, on the other hand, views its establishment as a legitimate act of self-determination following centuries of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. This narrative emphasizes survival, security, and the right to defend the Jewish state. From this perspective, Gaza represents a security threat rooted in hostility toward Israel's very existence. This clash of foundational narratives, Palestinian dispossession versus Jewish survival, makes compromise extraordinarily difficult and ensures that Gaza remains a flashpoint. The wars between Israel and Gaza cannot be separated from the borders created in 1948. Gaza's isolation is a direct result of how boundaries were drawn after Israel's establishment. Israel controls most access points, airspace, and maritime borders, citing security concerns that stem from decades of hostility. Palestinians in Gaza experience this control as collective punishment, reinforcing the belief that the injustices of 1948 never ended but simply evolved into new forms. Each cycle of violence in Gaza reinforces memories of the original trauma. Israeli military operations are often justified as responses to rocket fire or attacks, while Palestinians view them as part of a long history of displacement and domination that began with Israel's creation. Civilian casualties, destroyed infrastructure, and repeated displacement within Gaza echo the original Nakba, deepening generational trauma and hardening attitudes on both sides. International responses to Gaza are also shaped by 1948. The global community's recognition of Israel without a simultaneous resolution of Palestinian statehood created a structural imbalance that persists. Gaza's humanitarian crises are treated as emergencies rather than symptoms of a political failure. Dating back to Israel's establishment, This approach allows the root causes statelessness, refugees, and contested legitimacy to remain unresolved. The establishment of Israel also led to a regional conflict that further trapped Gaza in cycles of war, Arab-Israeli wars, peace treaties, and shifting alliances. All stem from the original 1948 conflict. Gaza's political isolation increased as Egypt distanced itself and Israel tightened control. This isolation made Gaza more susceptible to radicalization, as frustration and despair grew in a population with limited prospects and constant reminders of historical loss. Over time, the memory of 1948 became mythologized and politicized on both sides. For Palestinians in Gaza, it is remembered not as distant history, but as a living injustice shaping daily life. For Israelis, the same year represents independence and survival against overwhelming odds. These opposing interpretations mean that every confrontation in Gaza is symbolically linked to the moment Israel was created, making each war feel existential rather than limited or tactical. The ongoing war in Gaza is therefore not simply about borders, security, or militant groups. It is the latest chapter in a conflict whose foundations were laid in 1948. The displacement of Palestinians, the absence of a sovereign Palestinian state, the unresolved refugee crisis, and the clash of national narratives all originate from Israel's establishment. Gaza, more than any other place, carries the concentrated weight of these unresolved issues. As long as the consequences of 1948 remain unaddressed, Gaza is likely to remain a center of conflict. The war is sustained not only by immediate triggers, but by a historical wound that has never healed. The establishment of Israel did not just create a new state, it created a fractured land and two peoples bound together by trauma, fear, and competing claims. Gaza stands as one of the clearest reminders that the events of 1948 are not finished history but an active force, shaping the present and fueling the ongoing war.